Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. It was the first winter I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I had just moved into a split-level duplex on a very quiet cul-de-sac in Overland Park, Kansas. It was one of those neighborhoods where the trees are massive and the streetlights are spaced just a little too far apart, leaving deep pockets of shadow between the houses. I was 24 at the time and working as a freelance editor, which meant I spent most of my nights awake and most of my days catching up on sleep. The duplex was an older building, probably from the late 70s, with a shared wall that didn't do a very good job of blocking out noise. My side of the house felt cozy enough, but the layout was a bit strange. The front door led into a small landing, with stairs going up to the kitchen and down to a finished basement area. On the side of the house, there was a wooden privacy fence with a heavy latch that led to a small side yard and a secondary entrance. I rarely used that side gate because the driveway was right in front of the porch, making the front door much more convenient. My neighbor, a man I only knew as Arthur, lived on the other side of the duplex. From the day I moved in, I noticed something odd about him. Arthur was a tall, thin man, probably in his late 50s, who always wore a faded beige windbreaker regardless of the weather. The thing that stood out to me wasn't his appearance, though. It was his routine. I never once saw him use his front door. His driveway stayed empty, his porch was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, and his mail frequently overflowed from the box until the carrier eventually stopped leaving it. Instead, Arthur exclusively used his side gate. Every morning at approximately 8:15 a.m., I would hear the heavy thud of his wooden gate swinging shut. Then around 5:30 p.m., I would hear the metallic clink of the latch as he returned. He would disappear into the shadows of the narrow alleyway between our houses and go into his side entrance. I never saw him carrying groceries or trash bags. He just walked with his hands in his pockets, staring straight ahead, never glancing toward my windows. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has their quirks, and I figured maybe his front door was stuck or he just preferred the privacy of the side entrance. But about 3 weeks into my lease, things started to feel a little off. It began with my own side gate. I'm a very meticulous person, especially when I'm living alone in a new city. I always made sure my side gate was latched tight because it led directly to my bedroom sliding glass door in the back. One Tuesday morning around 10:45 a.m., I went out back to put some cardboard in the recycling bin. As I walked past the side of the house, I noticed my gate was standing wide open. It wasn't just unlatched, it was pushed all the way back against the fence. I felt a small prickle of unease, but I told myself the wind must have caught it, even though the air was perfectly still that day. I pulled it shut, made sure the latch clicked into place, and went back inside to finish my work. That night I was sitting in my living room with only a small lamp on. The house was dead quiet, except for the occasional groan of the heater. Around 1:30 a.m. I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a rhythmic, scraping noise coming from the shared wall in the basement. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy and metallic across a concrete floor. I knew Arthur's basement was on the other side of that wall, but the sound felt much closer than it should have. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, listening intently. The scraping lasted for about a minute and then stopped abruptly. I waited for the sound of footsteps or a door closing, but there was nothing but total silence. I eventually convinced myself that Arthur was just moving some old furniture around, even though 1:30 a.m. was a strange time to be doing home renovations. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep very well that night. The next morning I looked out my kitchen window and saw that my side gate was open again. This time I knew for a fact that I had latched it. I walked outside, my heart beating a little faster than usual, and inspected the gate. There were no marks on the wood and the latch didn't seem broken, but then I looked down at the damp earth near the fence post. There was a single, clear footprint in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was a narrow, flat-soled shoe print aimed directly toward the back of my house. I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. I looked over at Arthur's side of the duplex. His windows were dark and his front porch was as desolate as ever. I decided right then that I needed to talk to him. I walked over to his front door and knocked loudly. I waited for a long time, but no one answered. I tried again, thinking maybe he couldn't hear me through the heavy wood, but the house felt empty. I eventually gave up and went back to my side, feeling more exposed than I ever had before. That evening I decided to stay up and watch the side yard. I turned off all the lights in my house so I could see out the window without being seen. I sat in a chair by the kitchen window, which gave me a perfect view of my side gate. The hours ticked by slowly. 11 p.m. passed, then 12 a.m. The neighborhood was completely dark, and the only sound was the occasional car driving by on the main road a few blocks away. At exactly 2:45 a.m. I saw a movement in the shadows. A figure emerged from the side of Arthur's house. It was Arthur. He wasn't walking toward the street, though. He stepped over the small decorative stone wall that separated our properties and walked straight to my gate. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, lifted the latch with a practiced motion, and stepped into my side yard. He didn't go toward my back door. Instead, he just stood there in the darkness, facing my bedroom window. He stayed perfectly still for nearly 10 minutes. I was paralyzed, clutching my phone and wondering if I should call the police. Just as I was about to dial 911, he reached out and gently pulled my gate shut behind him as he left. He walked back to his side of the house and disappeared into his side entrance. He never looked up. He never checked to see if anyone was watching. It was as if he believed he was completely invisible in the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I went to the local hardware store and bought a heavy-duty padlock for the gate and a couple of motion-activated floodlights. I spent the afternoon installing them, hoping that the bright lights would be enough to keep him away. While I was on the ladder, I happened to glance over the top of the privacy fence into Arthur's side yard. What I saw made my blood run cold. His side entrance wasn't a door at all. It was just a frame with a piece of plywood leaned against it. Behind the plywood there was nothing but a dark, gaping hole that led into the crawl space of the duplex. There was no handle, no lock, and no stairs. It looked like a tunnel. I realized then that Arthur hadn't been going into a kitchen or a mudroom. He had been living under the house, or at least using the crawl space to move between the two units. I climbed down the ladder, my hands shaking. I immediately called my landlord, an older woman who lived on the other side of town. When I told her about the neighbor and the side entrance, she sounded confused. She told me that the other side of the duplex was supposed to be vacant. She said a man named Arthur had lived there years ago, but he had been evicted nearly 8 months before I moved in. She insisted that the unit was locked up tight and that no one should be there. She promised to come over the next morning with a locksmith to check the property. That night, I pushed a heavy dresser in front of my bedroom's sliding glass door. I left every light in the house on, including the new floodlights outside. I sat on my bed with a baseball bat, listening to every creak and groan of the building. Around 3:20 p.m., the motion light in the side yard snapped on, flooding the alleyway with bright, white light. I crept toward the window and peeked through the blinds. Arthur was standing right under the light. He was staring directly at the new padlock on the gate. He didn't look angry, he just looked confused. He reached out and touched the lock, running his fingers over the cold metal. Then he looked up. For the first time, he looked directly into my window. His eyes were wide and completely vacant, like he was looking through me rather than at me. He stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring at the glass. Eventually, he turned around and walked back toward his side of the house. I heard the plywood scrape against the foundation as he moved it, and then the neighborhood went silent again. I stayed awake until the sun came up, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. I felt like I was being hunted in my own home, trapped in a space that was no longer mine. The landlord arrived at 10 a.m. the next morning with the police. They broke the lock on the front door of Arthur's unit and went inside. I stood on the sidewalk, watching as they moved through the house with flashlights. A few minutes later, one of the officers came out looking pale. He told me the house was completely empty of furniture, but the floorboards in the center of the living room had been pried up. Below the floorboards, they found a small, cramped living space carved out of the insulation and the dirt of the crawl space. There was a moth-eaten sleeping bag, a collection of empty water bottles, and dozens of photographs. My heart dropped when the officer showed them to me. They were all pictures of me. Some were taken from the side yard, showing me through the kitchen window. Others were taken from inside my own basement, looking up through the floor joists. The most terrifying part, however, was a small notebook they found. It contained a detailed log of my daily routine. It listed what time I woke up when I went to the store and exactly what time I turned off my lights each night. The final entry was from the night before. It simply read, "He changed the lock. I need to find another way in." The police searched the entire area, including the wooded creek behind the cul-de-sac, but they never found Arthur. I moved out of that duplex the very next day. I didn't even care about my security deposit or the remaining months on my lease. I packed my essentials and stayed in a hotel until I could find a new apartment on the other side of the city. I made sure the new place was on the 4th floor of a secure building with a 24-hour doorman. I thought that would be enough to make me feel safe again, but the paranoia never really left me. A few weeks ago, I was looking through some old files on my laptop when I noticed a new folder I didn't remember creating. It was labeled with the date I moved out of the duplex. Inside was a single video file, only 10 seconds long. It was recorded from the perspective of someone standing in the corner of my new bedroom, watching me sleep. The person filming was wearing a faded beige windbreaker sleeve that was just barely visible at the edge of the frame. I called the police again, but they couldn't trace how the file got onto my computer. I've changed my locks 3 times since then, and I've installed cameras in every room of my apartment. But sometimes, when I'm sitting in the silence of my living room at 3 a.m., I think I hear a familiar metallic clink coming from the hallway. I still don't know how he follows me or what he wants. I just know that every time I hear a door latch, I wonder if it's the front door he's finally decided to use. Story 2. Back in a third-floor walk-up apartment in Astoria, Queens, New York, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. The neighborhood was usually loud, but my street was tucked away in a corner that stayed surprisingly quiet. I had moved into the apartment in early March, and honestly, it was all I could afford at the time. The building was old, with narrow hallways and a smell of stale cooking and floor wax that never seemed to go away. My routine was pretty set in stone back then. I would leave for the gas station around 10 p.m. and get back home around 6:30 a.m. just as the sun was starting to come up over the city. It was a grueling schedule, and it left me feeling like a ghost in my own life. I didn't see many people except for the occasional commuter or the regulars at the station. That was probably why I didn't think much of my upstairs neighbor, Arthur, when we first met. Arthur lived directly above me on the fourth floor. He was a middle-aged guy, always dressed in beige or gray, and he had this very intense way of being friendly. The first time I met him was about a week after I moved in. I was carrying a bag of groceries up the stairs around 4 p.m. when he practically teleported into the hallway. He asked me how I was enjoying the neighborhood and if I had found the local laundromat yet. It felt like a normal conversation at first, but something about his eyes was off. He didn't blink much, and he stood just a little too close to me in the narrow hall. He kept nodding as I talked, like he was checking off boxes in his head. I told him I worked nights, and his face lit up in a way that felt almost predatory. He told me he was a freelance editor and worked from home, so he'd be around if I ever needed anything. As the weeks went by, Arthur became a constant fixture in my life. Every time I left for work at 10 p.m., he happened to be taking out his trash or checking his mail. He would always ask me about my day, but his questions were weirdly specific. One time he asked me if I enjoyed the Thai food I had ordered the night before. I remember freezing for a second because I hadn't told him I ordered food, and I had thrown the containers away inside my apartment. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he smelled it in the hallway or saw the delivery guy, but then it happened again. A few days later, he mentioned how much I must like that blue sweater I always wore on Tuesdays. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized he was right. I did wear that sweater every Tuesday because it was the only clean thing I had before laundry day. I started to feel like I was being watched, but I told myself I was just being paranoid from the lack of sleep. The real turning point happened on a Tuesday in late April. I had just gotten home from my shift at 6:45 a.m. and was walking up to my door. I saw a small, padded yellow envelope sitting on my welcome mat. There was no postage on it, just my name, Marisol, written in very neat, blocky handwriting. I took it inside, thinking it might be a spare key from my landlord or something I had forgotten I ordered. Inside the envelope was a plain plastic jewel case containing a DVD-R. The surface of the disc was white, and someone had written yesterday's date on it with a black Sharpie. I didn't even have a DVD player, but I remembered I had an old laptop in the back of my closet that still had a disk drive. I sat on my bed, my heart thumping against my ribs, and slid the disc into the side of the computer. The video file was titled S01E14, The Tuesday Routine. When I clicked play, my breath hitched in my throat. The footage was clear, high definition, and it showed me. It started with a shot of me walking into my apartment at 6:38 a.m. the previous morning, but the camera wasn't outside in the hallway. It was inside my living room, tucked into the corner of the ceiling where the molding met the wall. The video showed me setting down my keys, taking off my shoes, and walking into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. It was edited like a professional TV show. There were multiple camera angles. When I moved into the bedroom, the shot cut to a camera hidden somewhere near my dresser. When I sat on the couch to watch TV, the shot switched to a front-facing angle from inside the television stand itself. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, staring at the screen as I watched myself sleep for 6 hours. The footage was sped up, but every now and then it would slow down to normal speed when I moved or turned over in my sleep. At the very end of the video, a text overlay appeared on the screen in a clean white font. It said, "Episode 14 wrap. Great performance, Marisol. See you tomorrow." I felt like I was going to throw up. I jumped off my bed and started frantically searching my apartment. I didn't care about making noise or breaking things. I pulled the smoke detector off the wall and found a tiny pinhole lens wired into the building's electricity. I checked the vents, the light fixtures, and even the tiny hole in the bathroom mirror frame. I found 6 cameras in total, all of them professionally installed and nearly invisible. My first instinct was to call the police. I dialed 911, but when the dispatcher answered, I struggled to explain what was happening. 2 officers showed up about 30 minutes later. Around 8:15 a.m. they looked tired and didn't seem very impressed by the DVD. They told me that because there was no physical break-in and I didn't know for sure who put the cameras there, their options were limited. They went upstairs to talk to Arthur, but he didn't answer his door. One of the officers told me that people in New York do weird things all the time and that I should probably just change my locks and talk to my landlord. They left me with a case number and a feeling of complete and utter helplessness. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment another minute, but I had nowhere else to go and no money for a hotel. I decided to wait until it was dark and then pack as much as I could. I spent the day sitting on my floor in the middle of the living room, away from the cameras I had found. I felt like there were more that I hadn't discovered yet. Every creak of the floorboards from the fourth floor felt like a threat. I could hear Arthur moving around up there, his footsteps slow and deliberate, moving from one side of his apartment to the other. Around 7 p.m., the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across my walls. I started throwing my clothes into a suitcase, moving as fast as I could. As I was packing my bathroom supplies, I heard a soft thud against my front door. I froze, holding my breath. I waited for a knock, but it never came. I crept over to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but there was another yellow envelope on the mat. I didn't want to open it, but I felt like I had to know what was inside. I pulled it into the room and tore it open. This time there was no DVD. Instead, it was a piece of paper that looked like a script. At the top it said, Scene 15, The Departure. The dialogue was empty, but the stage directions described exactly what I was doing. Marisol packs her bags in a panic. She thinks she is escaping, but the season finale hasn't started yet. I realized then that Arthur wasn't just watching me. He was waiting for me. I looked up at the ceiling and saw a tiny red light blinking inside a hole I hadn't noticed before, right above the door. He was watching me read the note in real time. I grabbed my suitcase and my purse, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I ran down the stairs, my heart hammering in my ears, and burst out onto the sidewalk. I didn't go to my car. I knew he probably had a tracker on it or was watching the street. I ran toward the subway station, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I took the N train all the way into Manhattan and spent the night sitting in a 24-hour diner near Times Square. I stayed there until the sun came up, drinking cup after cup of bitter coffee and watching the door like a hawk. The next morning I called my brother, who lived in New Jersey. He drove over and helped me get the rest of my stuff out of the apartment. We didn't see Arthur the entire time we were there. His door remained shut and there was no sound coming from inside. I felt a small sense of relief as we loaded the last box into my brother's truck, but that relief was short-lived. As we were driving away, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, Season 1 Bloopers and Outtakes. I opened it and found a link to a private video hosting site. The video showed me from the night before, sitting in the diner in Manhattan. The camera was across the street, zoomed in through the window. It showed me looking at the door, looking at my phone, and crying into my coffee. The video ended with a shot of my brother's truck driving away from the apartment in Astoria. The camera was mounted on the back of a car that was following us right at that moment. I looked out the rear window of the truck and saw a plain, silver sedan about 3 cars back. It didn't have a front license plate, and the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see the driver. I told my brother to drive straight to the nearest police station. We pulled into the parking lot of the precinct in Queens, and the silver sedan kept driving, disappearing into the midday traffic. I spent 4 hours talking to a detective, showing him the emails and the videos. They took it more seriously this time, especially when they saw the footage of me in the diner. They sent a unit to Arthur's apartment with a search warrant. When they broke down the door, they found a room that looked like a professional television control center. There were 32 monitors on the wall, showing live feeds from every apartment in my building, plus several cameras on the street and in the subway station. But Arthur was gone. He had left behind a half-eaten sandwich and a note on the main desk that simply said, End of Season 1, renewed for Season 2. The police found out that Arthur wasn't even his real name. He had used a stolen identity to rent the apartment, and he had been paying his rent in cash for over a year. They found high-end surveillance equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars, but no trace of where he had gone. They told me they would put out an alert, but they didn't sound very hopeful about finding him. I moved out of New York entirely after that. I stayed with my parents in Pennsylvania for a few months before finding a small place in a quiet town where I didn't know anyone. I changed my name legally, got a new phone number, and I never used social media anymore. I thought I had finally escaped the show that Arthur had created for me. I started to feel safe again, or at least as safe as someone can feel after something like that. But that feeling changed last week. It was a Friday night, around 11:45 p.m. I was getting ready for bed when I heard a soft thud against my front door. My heart stopped. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, listening to the silence of the house. I didn't want to look, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty, but sitting on the mat was a small, padded yellow envelope. I opened the door just enough to grab it and then locked every bolt I had. I sat on the floor, my hands shaking so hard I could barely tear the paper. Inside was a DVD-R with a white surface. Written on it in blocky black Sharpie were the words, S02E01, The New Beginning. I didn't even have to play the disc to know what was on it. I looked up at the ceiling of my new hallway, searching for a tiny red light or a pinhole lens I might have missed. I didn't see anything, but that didn't matter. I knew he was there somewhere, watching me through a screen and waiting for the next scene to start. I realized then that as long as I was alive, the show would never be over. I'm sitting in my living room now, writing this down at 3:33 a.m. Every time the house creaks or the wind blows against the window, I jump. I keep thinking about that note he left in the apartment in Astoria. He didn't just want to watch me, he wanted to own my life. And the scariest part. Story 3. This happened during the first month of moving into my new home. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I had just turned 28 and finally saved up enough for a down payment on a place of my own. It was a recently built suburban development about 20 minutes outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. The neighborhood was one of those brand new subdivisions where half the houses were still under construction, and the trees were all tiny saplings held up by wooden stakes. It was quiet, maybe a little too quiet, but that was exactly what I wanted after living in a cramped apartment in the city for years. The day I moved in was typical for North Carolina in the summer, hot, humid, and completely exhausting. I spent the entire afternoon hauling boxes from a U-Haul truck into my living room while the sun beat down on the pavement. By about 6 p.m., I was sitting on my front porch steps, dripping with sweat and nursing a lukewarm bottle of water. That was when I first noticed the man across the street. He was standing on his own porch just watching me. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing a polo shirt tucked into cargo shorts and holding a pair of garden shears. He didn't wave or say anything at first, he just stood there with a neutral expression. It felt a little awkward, so I gave him a quick nod. He nodded back slowly and then went back inside his house. I didn't think much of it, assuming he was just the neighborhood watch type who was curious about the new guy. The next morning around 9:30 a.m., I walked out to my porch to grab the mail. Sitting right next to my front door was a neatly woven wicker basket. It was wrapped in clear plastic with a big yellow bow on top. I picked it up and brought it inside to the kitchen counter. Inside were some homemade oatmeal raisin cookies, a small jar of local honey, a map of the nearby parks, and a handwritten note on a piece of yellow legal paper. The note said, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Darnell. It's always good to see a fresh face on the block. If you ever need anything, I'm right across the street in the beige house. Here is a spare key just in case you ever get locked out. Neighbors should always look after neighbors. Arthur." I looked back into the basket and found a single silver key sitting at the bottom. I remember thinking it was a very kind gesture, but also a little bit strange. I had only been there for 24 hours and hadn't even properly introduced myself yet. Most people wait a few weeks before offering up something like a spare key. I also wondered how he even had a spare key to my house. Then I realized he probably meant he had made a copy for me to keep in the basket, or maybe the previous owners had left it with him. Later that evening, around 7:15 p.m., I decided to test the key. I went out to my front door, inserted the silver key into the deadbolt, and tried to turn it. It didn't budge. I thought maybe I was doing it wrong, so I jiggled it and tried again. Nothing. I went to the back door and the garage entry door to try it there too. The key didn't fit any of the locks on my house. I figured Arthur must have made a mistake and accidentally given me a key to his own house, or maybe a key to a shed he thought was on my property. I planned to walk over and return it the next day, but work got busy and I ended up getting home late for the next few nights. Every time I pulled into my driveway, usually around 6:45 p.m., I would see Arthur standing in his front window. He wasn't doing anything, just standing behind the blinds, watching my car pull in. By the end of the first week, the helpfulness started to get a little more intense. One afternoon, I was out in the driveway breaking down cardboard boxes when Arthur finally walked across the street to talk to me. He had a very soft, high-pitched voice that didn't really match his large frame. He asked me how I was liking the house and if I had settled in yet. I thanked him for the basket and mentioned that the key he left didn't seem to work on my doors. Arthur didn't look surprised. He just smiled, a very wide, toothy smile, and said, "Oh, don't worry about that, Darnell. You'll find a use for it eventually. Sometimes we don't know what needs unlocking until the time is right." He then started giving me advice on home security. He told me that the area wasn't as safe as it looked. He claimed there had been several break-ins in the nearby developments and urged me to always double-lock my side door. He even pointed at a specific window on the second floor of my house, my bedroom window, and told me the latch on those models was notoriously weak. He said he'd be keeping a close eye on it for me to make sure no one tried to climb up there. It was a deeply uncomfortable conversation. The way he spoke about my house made it sound like he knew the layout better than I did. I thanked him again, backed away slowly, and went inside. I made sure to lock every single door and window immediately. That night I had a hard time sleeping. I kept thinking about him standing across the street, staring up at my bedroom window in the dark. A few nights later, around 2:15 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just a rhythmic, metallic clicking coming from somewhere inside the house. I sat up in bed, holding my breath and listening. The house was brand new, so I knew it wasn't the sound of old pipes or settling floorboards. It sounded like someone was trying to turn a lock that was already engaged. I grabbed my phone and a heavy flashlight I kept in the nightstand. I walked out into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I checked the front door first. It was locked. I checked the back door and the garage. Everything was secure. I felt like I was being paranoid, so I headed back upstairs. As I passed the small walk-in closet in the hallway, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Down near the floorboards, behind a stack of unopened boxes, there was a small wooden panel. It looked like an access door for the plumbing or the crawl space. It was about 2 feet tall and had a small, circular silver lock on it. I moved the boxes aside and looked closer. My stomach dropped. The lock on this panel was brand new, and it looked exactly like the type of lock the silver key in the basket would fit. I went to the kitchen, grabbed the key from the junk drawer, and came back to the closet. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped it. I inserted the key into the small panel door. It slid in perfectly. I turned it, and with a soft click, the door popped open. I expected to see copper pipes or insulation. Instead, I saw a narrow, dark tunnel that led straight down into the foundation of the house. I shined my flashlight into the hole. The tunnel wasn't just dirt, it was lined with smooth concrete. It went down about 5 feet and then turned horizontally, heading toward the front of the house, right toward the street. I realized then that this wasn't part of the original construction. This had been added. I didn't want to go down there, but the fear of not knowing was worse than the fear of looking. I climbed into the small opening and crawled through the narrow space. The air was cold and smelled like damp earth and something sweet, like the oatmeal cookies from the basket. After crawling for about 20 feet, I reached a small, underground room. It was a tiny space, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. There was a single folding chair in the center and a small desk with a battery-powered monitor on it. I shined my light on the monitor. It was connected to 4 different cameras. One was aimed at my front porch, one was aimed at my back door. The third was inside my living room, hidden somewhere near the television. The 4th camera was the one that made me lose my breath. It was a high-angle shot of my bedroom, looking directly down at my bed. From this angle, I could see that the camera was hidden inside the smoke detector I had looked at every single night since I moved in. I wasn't just being watched from across the street. I was being watched from beneath my own feet. As I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, I heard a sound from the other side of the small room. There was another door, a heavy steel door that likely led to another tunnel. I heard the sound of a key turning in a lock. Someone was coming in from the other side. Someone was coming from across the street. I didn't stay to see who it was. I scrambled back through the concrete tunnel as fast as my limbs would move, scraping my elbows and knees against the rough walls. I practically flew out of the closet panel, slammed the wooden door shut, and locked it. I didn't even grab my shoes. I grabbed my car keys and ran out the front door, jumping into my car and backing out of the driveway at 40 miles per hour. As I pulled away, I looked at the beige house across the street. The front door was wide open, and the lights were on. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 5 miles away, where I called the police. It was 3:45 a.m. by the time they arrived at my house. The police searched the property and found the panel in my closet. They followed the tunnel, just like I had. They confirmed that it led all the way under the street and connected to the basement of Arthur's house. It was a professional-grade excavation, likely done while my house was still under construction. Arthur was nowhere to be found. His house was empty, except for a single room in the basement filled with hundreds of hours of video footage of the previous owners of my house, and the last 7 days of me. The police told me that the Arthur I met wasn't the real owner of the beige house. The real owner was an elderly woman who was currently in a nursing home, and the man had been squatting there for months, pretending to be a helpful neighbor while he worked on his tunnels. They found a collection of welcome baskets in his kitchen, all packed and ready for the next people who moved into the neighborhood. I never spent another night in that house. I put it back on the market a week later and took a huge financial loss just to get away from that street. I live in a high-rise apartment now, with 24-hour security and no neighbors across the street. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at 3 a.m., I'll hear a faint clicking sound coming from the wall. I try to tell myself it's just the building settling or the air conditioning turning on, but then I remember what Arthur told me on my driveway that day. He said that sometimes we don't know what needs unlocking until the time is right. I still have that silver key in a drawer somewhere, and every night I wonder if he's out there somewhere, waiting for me to find the next lock he's installed in my life. I hope you never receive a welcome basket from a stranger, because sometimes the person looking out for you is the one you should be most afraid of.